Whenever games get released nowadays, I seldom get disappointed because I've learned to keep my anticipation and excitement in check. Even when I had pre-ordered No Man's Sky in 2016 and quickly realized how shallow it was, my disappointment didn't come close to this year playing Lords of the Fallen. In fact, I distinctly remember the last time I was this disappointed in a game, and that was back in 2009 when Final Fantasy XIII came out, and dragged me out of the oblivious wonder that was my childhood straight into manhood filled with an unshaven bastard named reality and responsibility. On the brighter side, not everything is doom and gloom. Lords of the Fallen has an unforgettable atmosphere and, at times, looks top-notch in today's game selection. The graphic designers, concept artists and those that worked on the soundtrack has absolutely knocked it out of the park. Most, if not all, armor parts and weapons looks highly detailed and deliberate while retaining a distinct character and fulfills the styling fantasy to the fullest. If I'm being entirely honest, it might be my favorite arsenal of options and looks since Bloodborne. Adding the ability to change the tints and overall look of your style is genius for these types of games and adds a lot of possibility for expression. The game also features a lot of options when it comes to weapons, both weapon types as well as variations for those styles depending on your build, which means it's also highly replayable. You can even further change weapon effects and attributes by socketing gems into the weapons or shields. The same can mostly be said about magic. The system itself, being able to actively have 3 or more spells available depending on input, works miles better than the other Souls games. Umbral as a concept is fantastic. If you die in the mortal realm, you get an additional chance at life before finally kicking the bucket. And hiding items, lore and unlockable paths in the Umbral realm encourages you to traverse it, while also discouraging you from overstaying your welcome, with the dread building the longer you stay, eventually spawning a very powerful enemy. Umbral also allows you to traverse otherwise untraversable terrain, opening up more possibilities for interesting level design. The world feels established, especially for those that played and beat the game from 2014, which I did, and some characters definitely fits into the game naturally, having fleshed out stories and lore along with a good voice actor or actress. When beating a boss, instead of getting a soul that you're able to trade for an item, weapon, armor set or magic, you can distribute and choose yourself what parts of what boss you want to get. If you have enough Umbral scoring, you can for example choose to get everything from a singular boss and nothing from another. And finally, the game does have multiple endings, although some of them are harder to unlock than others. This and perhaps much more that I forgot to mention I love and can't get enough of. And that's why it hurts all the more when I say those are the only positives this game has to offer, and that the amount of negatives overshadow them tremendously. Most things that Lords of the Fallen suffers from can be branched out with patches or bug fixes, like pretty much every modern game, but even so it will take a long time and the core issues seems ingrained into the base game. Playing on console is a nightmare at times, even on performance mode with any extra features turned off. This can be easily spotted when in Umbral, and even when not, some areas can tank the performance so the enemies look like they belong in a PS1 game. Bugs galore and many things feel extremely wonky and unfinished throughout the game, while despite being slowly fixed also continues to introduce even more noticeable performance issues. The further you progress into the game, the worse it seems to get. The state of performance on consoles should warrant refunding the game, while PC is slightly better but it's also below par. The way Lords of the Fallen is structured could very well be interesting, promoting different available paths and exploration, but reality is the complete opposite, and the fact is, the game promotes a linear progression. This mostly stems from the way NPCs and their respective questlines work, as progression in an unintended way can completely break or straight up make it impossible to finish or access questlines, which also includes vendors. Kukajin is an NPC that you can find and free in Forsaken Fen, and she can help you out with some bosses in the game in exchange for an increasing amount of vigor. Now, the problem is that you can miss out on her entire questline if you either miss out on summoning her for any of the bosses she can help with, or if you accidentally manage to defeat the Light Reaper boss from the encounters throughout the game, and then you'll just have to redo the entire game just to finish her one quest. Making this 1,000 times more tedious is the fact that you can't summon her for a boss until you die at least once to that boss. Meaning you can also accidentally miss it if you're playing blind and you're just doing good and take the boss down in the first try. Just why? An addendum to the problems described is how easy it is to break questlines. Take Winterberry as an example. In Sunless Skin you come across Byron, which mentions a pendant having been stolen from the adjacent vestige. You progress until you get to the Skin Stealer boss fight, and afterwards you enter the elevator directly behind the arena and you've broken Winterberry's quest, effectively killing her off and missing out on a vendor. In actuality, what you're supposed to do is turn around, venture into the Revelation depths and progress all the way until you get to her. Talk to her and inform Byron about her before he has the chance to absolutely slaughter the poor kid. The same is true for pretty much all questlines. They're not obscure, they're unlogical and unnecessarily convoluted. Andreas of Ebb and Stomund is additional examples of very questionable choices. But without a doubt, Lords of the Fallen's biggest sin is the attitude towards enemy and level design, which also includes how Umbral works. The first non-tutorial area of the game, Abandoned Red Copse, isn't terrible, but getting to Pilgrim's Perch and you'll wish you were playing a less frustrating game. Obviously it's an area that's easy to die from falling, but also enemies standing behind corners waiting to push you off or sniping you from so far away that you cannot even see what killed you really tested my patience. And this continues and gets even worse as the game progresses. Add on to that how you sometimes have to enter Umbral to progress, and since your time in Umbral is effectively timed, you can't take your time and be careful. Hey, take a shot for every time I say time. Umbral also spawns random enemies now and then, either in front of or behind you, enemies that can also be ranged attackers. This random spawning never ends, and at times the enemy swarms you until you're just dead. The devs are also experts at hiding enemies behind crates, planks, ash or other places just to increase the odds of you getting killed from behind or at least damaged or interrupted. Especially ranged enemies are some of the worst offenders when it comes to fairness, in that there is none. It straight up feels like enemies are designed not as an obstacle, but as a means to specifically get you, like a gotcha moment, much akin to Dark Souls 2 at times. Like the devs don't realize what made the Souls games and Souls-likes fun. Sometimes enemies and also bosses has one or multiple parasites, which makes them unkillable or vastly stronger. These pods need to be drained in order to make the enemies vulnerable, but bringing forth the lantern takes time, and so does Umbral draining, so you can be swarmed or even killed meanwhile. Then there's the pattern of just dropping multiple enemies at you. Tough enemies, along with ranged and/or enemies hard to hit, making it at times 5 against 1 in the best case. It's so perfectly clear that this game is meant to play co-op and wasn't designed for a solo experience. The combat in Souls-likes and mainline games can be extremely punishing, and if combat doesn't work, neither does the basis of the game. In the case of Lords of the Fallen, it's no different. The issue arises from multiple small problems that comes together and creates a big one. The biggest, most annoying problem with combat is neither the floaty movement, hitboxes or repetitive enemies, but the lock-on system. By God, the lock-on system is terrible. The system straight up doesn't work. Sometimes you lock into enemies far off in the distance instead of the one directly in front of you, and sometimes you lock onto random Umbral eggs instead of the target you need to soul flay, and sometimes you'll not lock on at all, despite multiple attempts and the enemy in question actively attacking you. Umbral also means more enemies, which leads to less accurate lock-ons and more tedious swings. This is extremely frustrating. And bosses fare no better. The positive thing is that you're often against a singular enemy, so you don't have to worry about ambushes or swarming, while the negative thing is that bosses are unimaginative, reused as enemies, or suffer from being extremely forgettable. For reference, in my journeys across 3 individual saves, I've fought maybe 3-4 memorable bosses that provided a good enough challenge and wasn't complete horse shit. There are a few instances when you can't actively attack the boss you're facing and just have to run around or wait, which could have been interesting, yet execution wise doesn't really work. I have to just single out the Hollow Crow, with a great design and an intriguing lore, yet can honestly be placed upon the top 3 pedestal of worst bosses in a Souls game that I've played. It's that bad. Closing out this section, I'll mention that the game has a very bare bones character creator, is missing effects or other sounds at times, you can fall through the world randomly, and I critically question the decision to take damage when you're successful with a parry. That just shouldn't be the case. Lords of the Fallen has some concepts and ideas that I've been wanting for any Souls game for a long time, but it just feels like developers get in their own way, even resorting to quiet down criticism of their game. Criticism, not hate. They've pumped out patch after patch after patch, but it's also painfully clear how they don't even QA or test those patches thoroughly. And how it will affect players, nerfing spells, so even if you have the requirements to cast it, you don't have enough mana. They do things first, think second, which I think will only hurt the game in the long run, but I hope I'm wrong. Finally, I hope for the prosperity of Lords of the Fallen, but the betrayal will always be in the back of my mind. Paying $70 for this experience feels soul crushing, and I hope I never will again.